All right, you guys, this is our first lecture online. So, first one for me to do as well. So we'll hopefully get it to you pretty well. Again, remember you can print out the slides in outline format and then watch along with this. Or you could put them on a PDF and annotate on your iPad if you want to do it that way too. So you got a lot of choices there, but probably a good idea to have this material saved. Obviously, you'll always be able to go back and watch the PowerPoint, and you could even listen to the lecture again if you wanted to, but probably a good idea to have some form of note-taking to go along. And again, I think if you have an iPad, the best way is the iAnnotate to go with the notes. So as far as that goes. So here we go. We're talking about origins of government, where they come from, the types, forms, that type of thing. Along with all these lectures, we'll be pretty efficient in here. Again, I think the stuff that goes on the screen is something you're going to want to get for sure. And then you may have some additions. Tend to do like outline formats on lectures. So here we go. Probably important to get an idea of what politics and government are by definition, and so that's why we started here. Politics is probably something you hear about. It comes in a lot of different forms, not only in government, but we hear about office politics or politics that occur in families or other institutions. And idea here with politics is it's the process of deciding who gets the benefits in society and who is excluded. Now, I think there's another way to define it, and that is power. You can always put the word power in the place of politics, and politics and power are very much synonymous with each other. Think about who we consider to be the most powerful man in the world, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's the President of the United States. Some of it's his nuclear arsenal that he has a chance to unleash if he'd like. But ultimately, it's his ability to have won the highest ranking political office, thus the most powerful political office. So politics and power are basically synonyms. The government is an institution that sort of takes that law, the policy, all the things that put our nation together and puts those things into effect. This could be, whether it's in the form of a constitution or other document, or sometimes it's verbal. It just depends on where you are in the world. Obviously, we have a constitution in our country, but the idea that it's an institution that creates and implements policy and laws that guide the conduct of a nation and its citizen. And that is what a government is, whether it's there's a lot of different forms that we're going to get to here in a minute. Okay, what does our government do? And this is, and I say our, but really it's any. There are basically, we've got 6 bullet points. These are 6 things that the government is responsible for. And the first is to protect their territory and the people who live in it. And again, this becomes a really important thing when you start to consider how much money in our budget gets applied to protecting our citizens. And sometimes we think about this in the standpoint of military control, which is certainly just as important. It is probably the primary element, but you have to remember it also includes things like controlling our borders so that we don't have illegal immigrants, although we do have a problem with that in our country, and many others do as well. But the idea that here is that you would protect your territory, protect the citizenry, and allow for a national defense. Second, it's important to preserve order and stability. This is sort of your police force and potentially your courts, your firefighting, that type of thing that goes along. And again, just to kind of make sure that we have a stable, orderly society. We have rules that we have to live under, that type of thing. Next, we have to establish and maintain a legal system. And sometimes, at least in our country, the legal system can be a little frustrating. If any of you guys watched the Casey Anthony trial unfold over the early part of summer, that may be a frustration in some respects, but I think the legal system in our country is out there to sort of protect its citizens first, and then, set up some systems to make sure that people aren't wrongfully accused. But regardless, and better, no matter what system you're in, it doesn't have to be just ours. The legal system is there. The government needs to provide services. This could include, in our country, include social programs like welfare or Medicare. But it could include things like what you guys may care about here in the new future, or in your end of this year as you're applying to schools and colleges and stuff, especially if you're looking at junior college or the Cal States or UCs. It is aid, right? You want aid and tuition assistance and that kind of thing that may come from our government, and you look for that. Our government's also responsible to raise and spend money. This is a huge topic right now. as I'm recording this in the summer. This is a big deal with our debt ceiling, and a lot of things we'll be talking about maybe in class as we get into school. This debt ceiling problem hopefully will have been solved by the time we get to class, but this idea of how much should we be charging people for taxes, who should pay them, and then who should get the money, where is that money being spent? And then finally, the government's job is to socialize new generations, and a lot of that happens in schools. In fact, the vast majority of this occurs in the classroom, although it also occurs in families. And you think about, and I'm sure you've seen video maybe of Germany during the start of World War II when Hitler is there, and how much those young Germans were sort of indoctrinated in the idea that Jewish people were shouldn't be alive, basically, that they were so useless and not really they basically didn't have any value as human beings, and that was taught to those young kids, and it was built into their minds that they were comfortable with the fact that they were exterminating them. And again, that can be one element of it. It can also be socializing new generations, the idea of just sort of teaching them about how government works. In this case, in our country, right, you think about democracy, and we learn that at a very young age. So those are basically the 6 functions of government. Obviously, those get spread out into be huge, a lot of pieces to those, but those are kind of the key 6. All right, so that's what governments do, and this isn't just America; it's all governments around the world. Okay, there's different types of government. Some of these you've certainly heard of, and so we'll go sort of quickly through some of those. The most, certainly one we've known about is a monarchy. This is the case where a king or queen has absolute authority over a territory and its government. Again, there really aren't too many pure monarchies left in the world. Ultimately, this is the period of time in Europe and I guess in some respects Asia during that feudal times and the what we might call the Middle Ages, when the kings or queens really were dominant. But those are monarchies. Oligarchy, basically a few people hold power, so you've got maybe 3 or 4 or 5 individuals that are within a government that hold all of the power. Some countries have versions of this around the world, where ultimately, maybe there's the head of the legislative or maybe what we would consider kind of a congressional branch, and then you've got maybe a president or a premier, and then maybe someone that's in charge of those courts or something of that nature, and those 3 make a lot of the decisions, however they check and balance one another. Those things are out there. Democracy, probably the one we're most familiar with, because this is what we have in our country, and the idea that the power to govern lies with the citizens, that we get to choose, and we can do this in a lot of different ways, but probably the biggest and most powerful thing we can do as a citizenry is vote, and so that's a huge piece to the puzzle there with democracy. A few of the others here that are a little more negative, possibly, totalitarianism, tyrannical government, controlling every aspect of citizens' lives. Certainly we think of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. You saw this form of government. We see a little bit right now with Libya, with Omar Gaddafi, and ultimately there's some rebellion going on there. So that's some things that are going on. Authoritarianism, strong powers, but there's something else that would allow for some checks on those. Again, typically this would be maybe a situation where a leader is in charge, and there are groups that could sort of decide to veto or not allow him or her to pass certain laws or things. So it's sort of a little bit of a balance, not quite as aggressive as the totalitarianism. And then you've got constitutionalism. And in this case, you've got a government that's structured by law, and often that law includes ways to limit the government, which is really critical if you start to think about some of the things, especially in our country, that we consider to be very important. We don't want the government walking into our house anytime they want, so that is limited in our Constitution. So constitutionalism, again, very common for countries to have constitutionalism. In fact, some countries use constitutions to set up a totalitarian government. It just depends, but the ultimate idea here is that you've got a structure which is written down that everyone can look at. All right, so those are some different forms. Now we're going to talk about very quickly the different ways that states have come about. Now, one of the things I want to keep in mind here, you guys, is that when I'm talking about state on these next few slides, I'm not talking about California, Nebraska, Iowa. I'm talking about countries, and state is a way that you'll hear people talk about countries as a whole. So just be careful that we're taught what we're talking about when we talk about states. Once we get just into American government, we'll separate, and the states will become Iowa, California, etc. Right now, in the early part of the year, states may refer to countries as a whole, and that's how I've done it here. At any rate, there's basically 4 theories on how states sort of came about. This is over time, and the first is one that seems pretty obvious: the force theory, where people basically came to the conclusion that they were going to take over a territory or a group of people and force them to submit to their rule. This is a very, very common way to expand your area or your state, but certainly the Romans fall into this category very early on in cultures. There have been many, many examples otherwise. Certainly students often bring up Nazi Germany at this time, or maybe even parts of the Soviet Union when they were expanding. So, but this is the force idea, right? You're putting everybody in there and you're forcing them to believe in what you want to believe. Evolutionary theory. This is a little bit more going back culturally, where you start out with maybe some families or groups of people that would get together and form clans, and then as the society developed, maybe they turned to agriculture, maybe they found out that it was easier to hunt animals or gather food if they used large groups of families working together, maybe in the form of a clan and then a tribe, and just developed into these huge cultures. Now, most of the Native Americans that were living in the United States fall into this category, although they weren't as large a society as maybe some in Central and Southern America, the Central America and Southern America cultures like the Olmecs and the Mayans, who became very large. I mean, huge cities were formed, that type of thing. But again, the concept is it started out of not anything like force, but just sort of evolved into this large city, or maybe into a large culture as they found out that they could take advantage of the number of people they would have. So this is the evolutionary theory. There really aren't too many examples of this left in the world. Maybe in some portions of South America, maybe some in Africa, but very few around the world. Divine right theory. This is one that we certainly are familiar with from world history. And this is the idea that God has given a few people the right to lead. And one thing that I want to make very clear here, because I think it's, certainly we understand that God gives us all of our strengths. And that's something we understand and believe in. And so God has certainly granted people leadership, right? That's something that is not an innate thing. You can learn it a little bit, but for the most part, right, God's given some people leadership skills. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is that these people believed that because of who they were born into, what families they were part of, that God had given them that right based on that family situation. We know that's not true, but that's what they thought, and they used that as a way to maintain power. Excuse me. Most of our current governments in the world are formed out of a challenge to this belief. So if you go back in time and you think about, again, going back to these monarchies that really were established in Europe, certainly in feudal Asia, etc., most of the countries that are out there now were formed because they didn't want to deal with a king and queen. And certainly America falls into that category. You can see the dates there, 1400s to 1700s. Again, this is the divine right theory, that divine right being that God gave them the right to lead. And then finally, the social contract theory. And what's sort of unique about this one is that certainly this is where America comes from. And this was presented by a number of people. And I'm going to give you some names here, and then you're going to look at some of these guys a little bit later on. But John Locke, Locke, is one. And again, you have an assignment that relates to John. And then guys like Thomas Hobbes. There were several others that came up with these ideas that free people that had this social contract within one another to help everybody be okay. And certainly when you lived in a certain territory or area, that it was partly society's role to make sure that everyone's okay, that we just have this, what they would call a social contract that sort of binds us to take care of one another. And I think this is a very a pretty normal thing for us if we start thinking about, right, that, you know, even in our belief systems, that it's important to take care of the poor and the needy. Now, you may have your own opinions about welfare or some social programs that our government has, but I think everyone thinks that, you know, we want to do what we can to try and help those people. Whether that's the role of the government or the role of something else is sort of your, you know, maybe affects how you believe in politics and government style. But ultimately, this concept that there's a social contract out there that we need to make sure that everyone's okay, that live within a certain territory or nation is pretty, you know, legitimate. The Declaration of Independence is based on this concept. So, anyways, what's unique about this is that it led to very large differences in the types of governments that had this. And again, I mention this because of my two examples. You may not know very much about communism right now, but I'm confident that you know that it's very different than democracy. And the idea that both of these types of governments came from social contract theory is just sort of interesting. Karl Marx, who was one of the founders of communism, wrote the Communist Manifesto. He's a social contract theorist, much like Thomas Jefferson. And so, you know, you think about that, and it's just kind of a unique thing. But this social contract theory is where most states that are around today have come from. Okay? So there's the end of the first lecture. Again, make sure that you've annotated via your iPad or you've printed out the outline form for notes so that you'll have those to study in the future. And, you know, that should get us along where you'll need to get for our first quiz. Thanks.